The hallway outside, room 209, always smells faintly of lilies, though no one brings flowers anymore. It's the kind of smell that clings stubbornly, like a half-remembered dream that you're not sure ever really happened. The light under the door glows at night, a dull, steady glow that shouldn't be there, because that room was supposed to be empty, sealed off after the last resident passed, or so they said. But the light refuses to die, flickering softly like a heartbeat in the dark. It's been there for as long as I can remember, and every time I pass, I feel like someone's watching me, waiting for me to stop and listen. I never do, not for long. My name is Harold. I'm 59 years old, and I've worked the night shift as a floor attendant here at Willow Creek Nursing Home for 12 years now. Night shifts can break a person in ways you don't expect, stretching quiet into something heavy and tangible, something that presses into your chest until you can hardly breathe. I used to drink, back when the nights felt too long and the silence screamed too loud. But I don't anymore, not because I found peace, but because I'm scared of what I might see when I'm not sober. When the edges of the night blur, the shadows here get sharp and close, and sometimes they reach out. Room 209 was once a sunny corner room with a big window that looked out over the garden courtyard. The last resident there was Mrs. Eaton, soft-spoken, fragile, the kind of woman who smelled like powder and old paper. She had dementia, and in her last days, she'd whisper secrets to the walls, tell stories no one else could hear. When she died, they sealed the room. They said it was too old, too drafty, and unsafe for anyone else. But I kept finding that door unlocked, or cracked open just enough to slip through. At first, I thought it was just a mistake. Someone forgot to lock it, or a breeze nudged it ajar. But it wasn't. I would come in on my rounds and find the chair Mrs. Eaton sat in turned toward the window. Sometimes, there would be a faint warmth in the room, like a breath left behind. The bed sheets would be rumpled, even though the room was supposed to be empty. The light under the door, always glowing, pulsing softly, like a pulse beneath my skin. One night, the silence in the hallway was so thick, I could hear my own heartbeat. The usual hum of the air conditioner had stopped, and the corridor was still too still. I walked past room 209 and saw that faint light glowing beneath the door. For reasons I still can't explain, I pressed my ear against the wood. At first, there was nothing but the slow rhythm of my own breathing. Then, a soft humming, barely more than a whisper, like a lullaby sung in a forgotten language. I leaned closer. The door creaked open just a fraction, and there she was, a woman in a pale nightgown, her hair tangled and gray, sitting in the chair facing the window. She didn't turn at first, but then slowly, she did. And when she looked at me, I felt the air go cold. Her eyes were empty pools, reflecting nothing. I wanted to speak, but no words came out. She opened her mouth, and though her lips barely moved, I heard her voice clear in my mind. "You left me here." The weight of those words crushed something inside me. I knew who she was before I even looked. Mrs. Eaton, the woman who shared a room with my mother in the final months before she passed. I had always avoided visiting my mother's wing at night, always made excuses to switch shifts or come early. I thought I was protecting myself from pain, but maybe I was just running from guilt. That night, standing frozen in front of room 209, I realized that something in that room remembers what I tried to forget. From then on, I started paying more attention. The light under the door would flicker faster when I was nearby, and sometimes I'd catch the scent of her perfume, the faintest trace of lilies mixed with powder. One night, I swore I heard footsteps pacing the room, slow and deliberate. The chair would face the window one moment, then turn away the next. It was like the room was alive with waiting, with longing. I began talking to her, whispering apologies into the dark hallway, though I never heard a reply. I told her I was sorry I didn't visit, that I was scared to face what was coming. I wanted her to know I hadn't forgotten, even if it was too late. Some nights, I swear the light flickers in response, as if she hears me. It wasn't just guilt anymore. There was something else there. Something that felt like a story trapped between walls. A loneliness that clung like dust. I started to dream about her. Dream of the room bathed in soft sunlight. Of a woman waiting for company. Waiting for forgiveness. In those dreams, she was never angry. Just waiting. One cold November night, the building's power went out during a storm. The whole wing plunged into darkness, except for that stubborn glow beneath room 209's door. I carried a flashlight, but the beam faltered when I pointed it toward the door. The light seemed to pulse from inside itself, unearthly and steady. I sat down outside the door, my back against the wall, and I whispered again, "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." The hallway was silent, except for the rain tapping against the windows. After what felt like hours, the light finally flickered once, and went out. The next morning, the door was locked tight. No scent of lilies, no warmth, no humming. Just the cold, empty room the logbook said was sealed for good. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, that my words had crossed some invisible line. Since then, I keep the key to room 209 in my pocket. I don't go in, but sometimes I catch myself standing outside the door, listening for a sign that she's still there, still waiting. The others think I'm just tired, maybe slipping into old habits of talking to myself during the night shift. But I know better. That room holds a memory too heavy for silence, and maybe that's what scares me most. Not the light, not the ghost, but the weight of regret that stays long after the living have gone. Sometimes, in the dead hours, I think I hear her humming again, a soft broken lullaby that settles over the floor like a breath. And I wonder if somewhere in the dark, she's still waiting for me to come home. The room always smells like lavender. It's strange, because no one ever sprays it, and the cleaning staff insists they don't use anything with fragrance in that wing anymore. But when I step inside room 114, the scent is there, faint and persistent, like a memory you can't shake. The shoes are always there too, a pair of worn beige slippers, neatly placed by the side of the bed, even though the resident who once owned them hasn't been there for months. The slippers sit as if waiting for someone to slip their feet inside again. I never touch them. I never move them. They just wait, silently, night after night. My name is Sophie. I'm 28 years old, and I work as a nurse here at Maplewood Care Home. I've been on the night shift for about 4 years now, and the quiet hours have a way of stretching out into something vast and strange. Most nights, I keep busy, checking vitals, administering medications, making sure everyone is safe. But some nights, especially when the world feels heavier than usual, I find myself drawn to room 114. Maybe it's the lavender, or maybe it's the slippers that never seem to disappear. Whatever it is, there's a stillness there that pulls me in, like a silent plea. The woman who lived there was Mrs. Carmichael. She was kind but fragile, and her husband used to visit every day, sitting by her bedside, holding her hand, talking softly, but then he stopped coming. I never asked why. To when she passed, they moved her things out, but the slippers stayed. Staff joked that she must have left them behind on purpose, but no one knew for sure. The slippers just sat there, untouched, like a quiet reminder that someone was missing. To one night, I was finishing my rounds when I heard a faint tapping near the door. I paused, heart beating a little faster. The hallway was empty except for me, but the sound kept coming, a soft, steady tap, tap, tap. I looked down and noticed the slippers had moved. They were no longer perfectly side by side but slightly apart, as if someone had just stepped out of them. I swallowed hard and backed away without turning around. After that night, I kept checking on the slippers, almost obsessively. Sometimes they were in different positions. Sometimes one was turned so that the heel faced the door. I tried to convince myself it was just a draft or a prank by the day staff, but deep down, I knew it was something else. something that belonged to the woman who once wore them. But one evening, during a particularly slow shift, I found myself sitting outside, room 114, longer than usual. The lavender smell was stronger that night, wrapping around me like a soft blanket. I felt a strange ache in my chest, like a door left open inside me. I whispered her name, Mrs. Carmichael, as if speaking aloud could summon her presence, could make sense of the silence. Suddenly, the slippers scraped softly against the floor. I jumped up, heart pounding. For a moment I thought I saw a shadow flicker near the bed, but when I blinked, it was gone. The room was still again, except for the faintest sound of breathing. Not mine, something else, something small and hesitant. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the exhaustion was catching up to me. But every night after, the slippers shifted, sometimes closer to the bed, sometimes nearer the door, and the lavender scent grew stronger, sweeter, almost cloying. One night, the power flickered during a storm, and the hall plunged into darkness. I was making my way down the corridor when the emergency lights kicked in, casting a weak red glow. Outside room 114, the slippers were glowing faintly, bathed in an eerie light that didn't come from any bulb. I knelt down, trembling, and reached out to touch them, but my fingers froze inches away. The slippers were warm, almost alive. I heard a whisper then, so soft I thought I'd imagined it. "Wait for me." The words were fragile, broken, like they came from a place beyond the living. I backed away slowly, feeling tears sting my eyes. That whisper haunted me for days afterward, replaying in my mind, like a ghost's confession. Who was waiting? And for what? I started to avoid room 114, even though the slippers called to me every night. But the more I tried to ignore it, the louder the silence around them became. The slippers seemed to gather all the loneliness of that room, the absence of a woman who once filled it with stories and laughter. One late night, after a rough day when I felt particularly empty, I stayed longer at room 114. The lavender scent was so strong it almost made me dizzy. I sat on the edge of the bed and whispered, "I'm here." For the first time, I felt a presence settle beside me, a weight that was neither cold nor warm, but something heavy and unresolved. I told her about my fears, about feeling invisible, about the nights when the silence swallowed me whole. It felt absurd, talking to a room and a pair of slippers like they were a living thing. But the presence stayed, patient and silent, like a friend who just needed to be heard. That night, the slippers moved again. This time, one slipped slowly under the bed, as if hiding. I reached out and pulled it back, tracing the worn leather with my fingers. It was strange, but comforting, as if I was touching a part of someone's soul. Weeks passed, and I found myself less afraid. The slippers no longer seemed like a warning, but a reminder, a fragile link between this world and the next. I never saw Mrs. Carmichael, never heard a voice again, but the slippers kept waiting, waiting for something I couldn't name. On my last shift before a planned break, I left the room quietly, the slippers untouched. The lavender scent followed me down the hallway, fading slowly until it was just a whisper in the night. Sometimes, I wonder if she's still there, waiting by the bed, hoping for someone to come home. And I wonder if, maybe, the slippers are a way for her to say she's not gone yet, that she still needs to be remembered. The care home is full of stories like this, quiet hauntings that slip between the cracks of everyday life. But room 114 is different. It holds a sadness that never leaves, a gentle ache that lingers long after the lights go out. When I think about it now, I realize the slippers aren't just waiting for Mrs. Carmichael. They're waiting for all of us, to remember, to forgive, to hold on to what we lost. And sometimes, in the darkest hours, when the world feels empty and still, I can almost hear her whisper again, soft, fragile, a breath in the silence. "Wait for me." The third bed in room 302 always felt out of place. It was an old iron frame, chipped and rusted, smaller than the others, almost forgotten in the corner by the window. No one ever slept there anymore, and yet it was never removed. The sheets on it were always perfectly neat, folded just so, as if someone was expected to return and claim it at any moment. The room had a coldness that went beyond the temperature, something that seeped into the bones, quiet and persistent. At night, when the halls were empty and the world narrowed down to the hum of machines and the occasional shuffle of footsteps, that third bed seemed to breathe its own kind of loneliness. My name is Mark. I'm 34, and I've worked as a night orderly at St. Agnes Psychiatric Hospital for the past 5 years. The job is exhausting in ways that no one outside these walls can understand. The endless cycles of light and dark, the whispered conversations that turn into silent screams, the steady weight of lives caught somewhere between hope and despair. But nothing has ever unsettled me quite like room 302 and its third bed. When I started, the room was occupied by 2 patients, Mrs. Delaney and Mr. Cross. They were quiet, distant, keeping mostly to themselves, except for the occasional word or glance. The nurses often told me to give the room space. They both had complicated histories and fragile minds. But it wasn't the patients who made me uneasy. It was the bed, the third bed. Mrs. Delaney told me once that the bed was for a third patient who had passed years ago, a young woman named Lily, who was transferred out but never left the hospital. Staff whispered about her, though never openly. Some said she died by her own hand, others that she simply faded away, swallowed by the shadows of the ward. Whatever the truth, the bed remained, a silent marker of something unresolved. On my first night, assigned to that room, I thought I heard soft footsteps when I passed by the door. I stopped and listened. The corridor was still, empty, except for the low hum of the ventilation system. I shook it off and moved on, but the feeling lingered, a presence just beyond sight, watching and waiting. Over the weeks, I began noticing subtle things. The third bed sheets would be slightly rumpled in the morning, even though no one had slept there. Small impressions, like someone had rested their head briefly or shifted position. Once I found the blanket pulled halfway down, as if someone had sat up suddenly, but no one was ever in that bed. I mentioned it to the night nurse, Jenna, who laughed softly and said, "That bed's got a history, Mark. Everyone feels it, but no one talks about it. It's like it remembers." The idea seemed ridiculous. At first, beds don't remember, but after a while, the feeling of being watched became harder to ignore. The air in that room thickened, growing heavier each night. Even Mrs. Delaney and Mr. Cross seemed more distant, their eyes haunted by something I couldn't name. One night, I was checking vitals when the power flickered, and the lights went out for a moment. When they came back on, the third bed was empty, but the chair by the window, where no one ever sat, was pushed out slightly, as if someone had just left it. My heart hammered, and I quickly finished my rounds. Later, as I was wiping down equipment, I heard a faint, almost inaudible whisper from the room. It was so soft I couldn't catch the words, but it carried a weight of sorrow, longing, and desperation. I stood frozen, waiting, but the room was silent again. The next day, I asked Mrs. Delaney about it. Her eyes were distant, haunted. "Lily doesn't like to be forgotten," she said quietly. "She waits for someone to see her, to remember her story." I wanted to believe it was just a story, a shared delusion born from the long nights and endless shadows. But something inside me stirred, a deep, unexplainable sadness. One night, during a particularly heavy storm, the alarms went off in the ward. I rushed to room 302 to find Mrs. Delaney sitting upright in her bed, eyes wide with fear. She pointed to the third bed. "She's here. She's angry." I looked and saw the blankets twisted into a tangled heap, the sheets stained with something dark I didn't want to identify. The room felt charged, electric with tension. I called for backup, but by the time the others arrived, the bed was calm again, just an empty, neatly made third bed. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Lily, who she was, why she stayed behind, why her presence clung to that bed like a shadow refusing to lift. I began reading old patient records, searching for any mention of her. What I found was scant, only a few notes, references to a young woman admitted with severe depression, transferred out after a few months, but never discharged properly. No one seemed to know what happened to her afterward. The more I learned, the more I felt the weight of her story pressing on me. It was as if Lily's unresolved pain was a thread pulling at the fabric of the hospital itself, weaving through the walls and floors, whispering through the night. One night, as I sat alone in room 302 after rounds, the third bed seemed to breathe beneath the sterile sheets. I reached out, my hand trembling, and touched the cold iron frame. Suddenly, a wave of memories flooded me, snatches of a young woman's life, her fear, her isolation, her desperate hope for escape. I saw her standing by the window, watching the rain, waiting for someone who never came. I heard her voice, a soft plea carried on the wind, "Don't forget me." Tears streamed down my face as I whispered back, "I see you, Lily. I won't forget." After that night, the heaviness in the room lifted slightly. The third bed still sat quietly, in the corner, but the air felt lighter, less charged with sorrow. Mrs. Delaney and Mr. Cross both passed away peacefully, not long after. The room was emptied, but the bed remained, unchanged, waiting for the next chapter. I often think about that bed, and the quiet lives that touched it, the ones who came, and the one who stayed behind. In a place meant to heal, some wounds never fully close. They linger like shadows, waiting to be acknowledged, waiting to be remembered. Sometimes, when the night is still, and the hospital sleeps, I pass by room 302, and see the third bed waiting patiently, and I wonder if Lily is still there, watching, hoping, whispering in the silence for someone to hear her story again. The garden courtyard at Rosevale was once beautiful, I'm told. Roses climbing trellises, lavender lining the stone paths, and the sound of wind chimes dancing in the breeze. But, by the time I started working here, it had become something else. The flowers had mostly died off, the benches were splintered and rotting, and ivy strangled the crumbling statues. Still, patients wandered there during the day. It was one of the few places left untouched by fluorescent lights and antiseptic air. But at night, the garden changed. The air thickened, the paths seemed to shift, and sometimes, only sometimes, you could hear soft footsteps on the gravel, even when you were alone. My name is Carla. I'm 50 years old, and have worked as an overnight caregiver for over 2 decades. When I transferred to Rosevale 3 years ago, I was looking for something quieter, a place to settle into the final stretch of my career. I didn't expect peace exactly, but I didn't expect whatever the garden was either. I first noticed it during my 2nd month. I'd step outside for air after rounds, just to breathe in something that didn't smell like bleach or rubber gloves. I'd sit on the far bench under the dead elm tree, where the moonlight made long shadows out of the cracked stones. One night, I saw someone sitting on the center bench, their head bowed, a woman in a patient gown, her silver hair long and wild. I called out, gently, not wanting to startle her. She didn't move. I approached slowly, but by the time I got close, she was gone. No sound, no footsteps, no doors opening, just gone. The courtyard gate creaked on its own that night, not a loud swing, just a nudge, like someone had passed through it without touching it. I didn't mention it to the others. We all have our ghosts in this job, and I'd learned early on that some things are better left unspoken. But I couldn't stop thinking about her. The way she sat so still, her body slumped like sorrow had taken shape. Over the following weeks, things shifted. Flowers began appearing in the garden again, just one or two at a time. A daffodil blooming where there had only been weeds, a rosebud on a dead bush, too early for spring, too strange to ignore. And then the lights, soft flickering, like lanterns or candles always just out of reach. I'd turn a corner and see a faint glow at the far end of the path, but by the time I got there, it was gone. A trick of the moon maybe, or maybe not. I began asking around about the garden. Most shrugged it off, some looked away, but an older nurse, Elena, finally offered something one night over lukewarm coffee in the break room. There was a woman, she said, years ago, patient named Ruth, dementia, mostly quiet. They say she used to garden here before she got worse, always barefoot, said the soil helped her remember. She wandered out one night. They found her the next morning, face down in the ivy, near the angel statue. She sipped her coffee. She died with dirt under her fingernails. After that, I started walking the garden deliberately, same path, every night after my shift ended. I felt like I owed it to her, to the woman with silver hair, to Ruth. And then I started dreaming, always the same dream. I'm in the courtyard, but it's full of life again. Flowers in bloom, bees buzzing, sunlight filtering through green leaves. And in the center, she stands barefoot, hands cupped around something glowing. I try to speak, but no sound comes out. She looks at me, and her eyes are filled with tears. Not fear, not sorrow, something deeper, something like waiting. The dreams would wake me up breathless, and I'd feel that tug, that quiet voice urging me to go back to the courtyard, not to fix anything, just to listen. One night, after a rough shift, I fell asleep on the bench beneath the elm. I must have drifted off, because I woke to the sound of humming, a soft, slow melody, carried on the breeze. I looked up, and she was there again, this time standing in the path. Her feet were bare, her hands were covered in soil. She hummed to the flowers that weren't there, and then slowly, she looked at me. "Don't let them forget," she whispered. Her voice was dry, like wind through brittle leaves. "Forget who?" I asked, but she was already walking away, fading into the vines. The next morning, I found muddy footprints on the garden path, small, bare, leading to the angel statue, and stopping there. The groundskeeper, Martin, said it must have been some kid breaking in, but there was no sign of disturbance, no damage, no open gates, just footprints, and a daffodil blooming in the palm of the angel. After that, things changed inside too. A few of the residents, mostly those with memory issues, began asking for the garden lady. One woman insisted she saw someone planting flowers in her room. Another claimed the courtyard whispered her name when the wind blew. I started bringing seeds into the courtyard, lavender, rosemary, old world flowers, the kind Ruth might have loved. I planted them quietly, beneath the moon, and over time, they grew, not just sprouted, thrived, even in the wrong season, even in the poor soil. I think she was grateful. But then came the night when everything stopped. The wind didn't blow, the flowers didn't sway, the courtyard felt hollow, as if something had left. I walked the path anyway, hoping to feel her, to hear her, but there was nothing, not even the usual creak of the gate, or hum of insects, just stillness, until I reached the angel statue. There, resting on the stone base, was a small perfect rose, fresh, dew-kissed, tied with a piece of linen torn from a patient gown. I sat there for a long time, listening to the silence. I think Ruth moved on that night, or maybe she chose to rest, but sometimes, just sometimes, I still hear her humming, very faintly, when I walk by the window overlooking the garden, and the flowers, they still bloom, even when no one tends them, even when no one remembers how they got there. Maybe that's all she ever wanted. Not to be mourned, just not to be erased. In this line of work, we lose people,
every day. Some slip away with family nearby, others quietly in their sleep, and some simply fade until we forget they were ever real. Their names vanish from charts, their rooms are cleaned, and their belongings boxed up. But the garden remembers. It grows things that shouldn't grow. It hums old songs no one taught it. And when the wind shifts just right, I swear it carries the scent of rosemary and roses, like someone long gone is still tending it, one memory at a time.
They always told me the walls had ears. As a hospice nurse, you learn not to laugh at things like that. You learn that dying people see and hear what others can't, and that sometimes the things they whisper in their last moments aren't just hallucinations. Sometimes they know something we don't, something they were never supposed to carry with them until the end. My name is Miriam. I've worked in palliative care for over 15 years. I've watched hundreds of people take their final breath, each death teaching me something new about life, about pain, about fear. But the one thing I never expected was to learn about him, the one who listens. It started with a patient named Harold. He was a quiet man, well into his 80s, with liver cancer that had spread far too quickly. He didn't talk much, but when he did, it was always to someone I couldn't see, not in the usual confused way that some patients drift into. He was focused, sharp, like he was reporting to someone. "He's closer now," Harold would whisper as I adjusted his pillows. "You hear that, Miriam? He's almost at the door." I'd ask him gently who he was referring to, but Harold would only shake his head and mutter, "Don't say his name. He listens. He always listens." I thought maybe he meant a son or brother he'd lost. Sometimes the dying conjure the living in strange ways, but Harold wasn't delusional. His vitals were failing, yes, but his mind was intact. On his third night, he refused to sleep, kept his eyes fixed on the corner of the room near the ceiling vent. He asked me to turn off the monitor, not just the sound, the screen too. He said the light attracted him. I humored him, thinking maybe it gave him peace. But when I turned it off, Harold let out a sigh that sounded like relief and closed his eyes, murmuring, "Not tonight." He's gone to the next room. Harold died the next evening, and I sat with him until his last breath. Just before he passed, he gripped my wrist and said, "Don't listen too long. He knows who listens back." I didn't sleep that night. In the following weeks, I started noticing it, a pattern I had ignored until Harold, patients on the verge of death, would pause and glance toward the same corner, the vent, or the ceiling tile above their heads. One woman, Lillian, asked me who the man in the corner was. When I turned around, of course, there was no one there, but she looked terrified. "He never blinks," she whispered. "He just watches, waiting, taking notes." Another patient, Theo, refused to speak above a whisper, said he could feel a presence that leaned in closer the louder he talked. He began scribbling his requests instead of saying them out loud, even for water. One night, I sat beside Theo after his breathing had become ragged. He wasn't long for this world, and I could tell he knew it, but he smiled, strangely peaceful, and handed me a folded piece of paper. I waited until after he passed to read it. It said he's not death, he's what comes before it. The listener, the one who collects the last secrets, and he only comes for the ones who know things they shouldn't. I didn't know what to make of it, but I started listening more closely. After that, not to the patients, but to the quiet, the heavy kind of silence that fills a room after midnight, when even the machines seem to hold their breath. I started hearing it too, a faint sound, like breathing, but not quite, a kind of whispering, but not voices, more like static that wasn't there before. It came from the vents, or from behind walls, or beneath the floorboards. Sometimes it stopped when I moved. Sometimes it followed me. I began to dread the overnight shifts. I found excuses to avoid the West Wing, especially room 12. That room always felt heavy, like something was pressing against the walls from the inside. The lights would flicker more often in there. One night, I went in to replace the saline bag and felt like I wasn't alone, though I was the only person on that side of the hall. Bast, when stored, what cording the night. Into it pouring meeting in seminite. A sound echoed, a faint dry scratching. I turned, expecting to see a nurse or a patient in the hallway, but it was empty. I stood there for what felt like minutes, holding the IV bag in my hand, the scratching still faint but constant, like nails on a padded wall. I didn't sleep at all that day. When I got home, things escalated. After a patient named Vera came in, she was terminal, suffering from advanced pancreatic cancer, but her mind was sharper than anyone I'd ever seen that far into illness. She asked me if I'd seen him. I didn't ask who. I didn't need to. I heard him before he came. She told me, when my husband was dying, he stood in the corner all night. I thought I was hallucinating, until he turned his head and looked at me. Vera said the listener collects knowledge, secrets the dying don't want to carry with them, things they never told anyone, and when they die with those secrets, he listens. He feeds off what people keep buried, and if someone listens back, really listens, then he takes something from them too. What does he take? I asked. Vera looked at me, her eyes wide, and whispered, the right to forget. She died 2 nights later, in her sleep. No struggle, but the monitor didn't record any vitals for the last 4 minutes. No flat line, just blankness, like she'd vanished before her body caught up. When I walked into her room, the vent was wide open, and someone had removed the cover from the floorboards beneath her bed. Since then, I've changed. I hear things more often, in my apartment, in the break room, in the elevator, when no one's riding with me, whispering, not words, just breath and tension. I stopped watching TV. The static hurts my ears. I unplugged my clock radio when it started ticking louder than it should. I tried to ignore it, but now I feel him every time someone dies. It's like a pressure behind my eyes, like someone's watching through me, not at me. 2 nights ago, I went into an empty patient room to cry. I don't even remember why, just stress, fear, exhaustion, and the moment I sat down, the light bulb overhead popped, the vent cover rattled, and something moved behind the wall, a long dragging scrape, like someone shifting their weight inside the dry wall. I didn't look up, I didn't speak, I held my breath until it stopped. I don't think he was after me, not yet, but I've listened too long, I've heard too much, and I think he knows. They say the dying speak truths at the edge of the veil, but they never tell you those truths might have teeth, that those who listen too closely might start to carry the same weight the dead were trying to unload. Sometimes when the hospice is still, and everyone is asleep, I sit in the dark, and whisper nothing, just to see if he's there. I never get an answer, but I always feel heard, and I know, one day soon he'll whisper back,